Despite the fact that the majority of what I know about comic book heroes is largely based on the movies, shows, and occasional wiki articles I read online, Batman is pretty much the only superhero whose comics I collected back during my teen years. Even then, I'm not as familiar with his lore as I'd like to be. It's mainly because I was the kind of comic book collector that would buy standalone issues that offered complete stories. I guess that's why it's easier for me to gravitate to manga. Still, those Batman comics, shows, movies, and video games have left me with a strong idea of who Batman/Bruce Wayne should be as a character. I'm sure that more diehard Batman fans could disagree with what I have to say about the character and this movie as a whole, but it is what it is. After all, this is my review, and these are my opinions. I'm not making it out to be as if I'm an authority on Batman, and at the end of the day, I know what I like and what I don't like. From the start, I loved how the introduction for both characters was handled. Both introductions were handled in such a way that they were meant to convey the idea that the Batman and the Riddler are two different sides of the same coin. As it's eventually shown towards the end of the movie, there's a very thin line that separates how both of them go about achieving their goals, but it's still a significant difference to showcase that these two characters aren't the same. As you're watching Gotham's mayor paying attention to what's playing out on TV, you quickly start to realize that someone's in the room with him. Before long, you see that it's the Riddler, and his brutal attack mixed in with his savage body language is meant to show you that he holds a lot of hatred for the mayor. Previous iterations of the Riddler made him seem like a threat from afar, but from the start, this Riddler comes off as a huge deal and threat. What I liked about the intro for both characters was that they were very methodical. It wasn't slow or fast, but just right. Any other movie would have had the Riddler make his debut with the violent attack that's later shown, but from the start, we're shown that this person is patient. What's great about this is that this too can be seen with how the movie plays out. It's a very patient movie that slowly builds up into moments where everything seems to be hitting you at once, but it doesn't seem inappropriate at all. I'll eventually get into where that's best seen, but for now, I'd like to discuss the Batman's introduction. Back when the trailers were the only thing we had to see whether or not Robert Pattinson would be a good Batman, it was easy to see that he seemed more violent and angry. Previous versions of Batman have killed, but for me, there's a difference between blowing up a factory versus viciously assaulting someone with your bare hands. I know that beating someone isn't the same as actually killing them, but I'm talking about optics. The Batman also takes his time to make his presence known, but by the time he does, he's not holding back at all. A thought that immediately came to mind was that he definitely is vengeful. He held nothing back when he fought, he reacted with a lot of emotion, and in general, he was a heavy-handed fighter. Some have previously joked that it's funny that some versions of Batman don't kill, but he might as well because of how savage he can be when beating down criminals. The same could be said for this version of the Batman. It was only the start of the movie and yet we were seeing him take on multiple thugs at the same time, while also letting us know that he wasn't limited to hand-to-hand combat. What I liked about this first scene with the Batman in action is that it showed us that he's not invincible. He's still in year 2 as the Batman, so he still has a lot to learn, and it shows by the occasional damage he'd take. This Batman has yet to become the world's greatest detective, but with how the rest of the movie plays out, it's clear that he's on the right path. I'm basing a lot of what I say about the Batman from the first trailer that was released because that's where I got my first impressions. As of this writing, I've seen the movie 3 times, but I like going back to my first impressions because those seem the sincerest to me. In promotional material, Matt Reeves said that this Batman would be more focused on detective work, and that the movie would come off as more of a mystery than past entries into the Batman franchise. I'm sure that some will argue for or against whether or not Matt Reeves and this movie worked as a mystery, but what I'm getting at is that it's clear that this was in mind all throughout the movie. I guess it's because the first trailer was so heavily based around the scene in which the Batman is investigating Riddler's first murder, so it was easy to really look into it. You could base an entire video around this scene and how well it works, but what stood out to me was how observant this Batman really is. In particular, it was when he realized that the mayor was still alive when his thumb was severed. I'm sure that someone with knowledge of forensic science/biology could understand how he was able to come to that conclusion, but since I'm not that kind of person, I could only go with what the movie was showing me. Either way, I like this because it got me prepared for what was to come. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this was a mystery on the same level as, say, Knives Out, but there was still enough of a mysterious element to this movie that you could say that it counts as one. I like that because other entries into the Batman franchise have only touched upon this aspect of the character. It's not as if this Batman was dusting for prints at a crime scene, but simply having him observe and make analytical statements based on what he saw was enough for me. I'd say that there are plenty of different elements that are necessary when it comes to successfully making a mystery movie, but seeing as how the Batman has more to offer, it was easy to see why it came off the way it did. The Batman could and most likely has been classified in all sorts of different ways. To say that it's a neo-noir might offend some of the more die-hard movie buffs, but it's clear that this movie has influences from multiple different genres of cinema. On the most basic level, the Batman reminded me of Seven. It wasn't just because it involved a sadistic murderer leading around the character, or in the case of Seven, characters, to the solution, but also because of its appearance. The Batman featured great use of darkness and lighting. It gave off an oppressive feeling, and the constant rain helped with that. It gave off the idea that Gotham City is a city without hope, and no matter how much you try, it's beyond saving. That's one of the reasons why the Batman does what he does, and the movie as a whole works to showcase why the opposite is true, but it's still fitting for it to try to visually match what the story has to offer. I already mentioned the rain, but the dim lighting in the streets also added to the atmosphere. It's not only because criminals can benefit from the darkness, but so can the Batman. I also particularly enjoyed the orphanage scene that played out later on in the movie. Not only was it dimly lit in there, it was derelict, covered with graffiti, and gave off the idea that a lot of suffering was endured here. It reminded me of when Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman's characters would walk into one of John Doe's crime scenes. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're on the same level, seeing as how Seven is a more disturbing and explicit movie, but it's clear that it had a part in influencing the Batman. In general, this was a very moody movie, and I loved that. I'm sure some may laugh at that description and think to themselves, he's calling it an emo movie, but that's not my point. What I mean is that the movie does a great job in delivering the full package with what it has to say and show. Overall, the color palette matched the mood of the movie, and I'm sure that it was intentional. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it was dark to the point where I had difficulty seeing what was being shown, but it was definitely the kind of movie that featured many drab colors. It makes sense though, seeing as how this is a movie covering a dark subject matter, and with an emotionally disturbed individual as the main character. Moving on to describing how the rest of the movie looked, it's worth saying that it looked great in more ways than one. It's not only because of the colors or how darkness/lighting was used, but also because the locations featured in it gave off the idea that this was a real city. It's worth mentioning because some movies, especially old ones, can more or less give themselves away. What I mean is that it's easy to tell when a movie has been filmed on a studio set, or it's been artificially made up to look a certain way. Even if Batman Forever means a lot to me, for multiple different reasons, at times it looked too hokey. That wasn't the case at all with the Batman, and I appreciated it. At this point in time, it's pretty fair to say that everyone and their grandmother has been influenced by Blade Runner. Simply put, it's because it's a great looking movie that still manages to stand out decades after it was initially released. I bring this up because that's the thought that came to mind as I was seeing Gotham Square for the first time. It was a good mix of bright and dreary at the same time. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it gives off a dystopian vibe, but it made me think of how some areas want to make themselves be seen as more when in reality, there's no true value beneath what's seen on the surface level. It makes sense why Gotham Square was packed as it was, seeing as how the movie begins on Halloween night, but it still works to show that Gotham City is a cramped one. Even if living in a big metropolitan area can be great for multiple different reasons, sometimes the proximity that exists between you and other residents can get to you. Either way, this was a movie that wanted to showcase how it looked, and it managed to accomplish that in more ways than one. Up until this point, I've been describing how and why Gotham City looks the way that it does, but that's mostly been me discussing the use of shadow and light to achieve a specific goal. When it came to the locations and sets being used, I got the idea that the point was to make it seem that there's a deep and rich history to Gotham City. Ornate architecture can also be used to give off the impression that money is in play, but without delving too much into the specific reason as to why it was used, I just wanted to say I loved how fancy Gotham City looked. I thought that Wayne Manor looked amazing, and as cheesy as it may sound, it reminded me of Hogwarts. If anything, I'd say that this was the best Wayne Manor out of all of the ones that have been featured in the Batman franchise. Others may have been larger, but this one didn't lack visual impressiveness. I realize that some may not care about this, but how a movie looks is of great importance to me. If you've seen or read some of my old reviews, you know that I regularly bring up being able to enjoy a movie with the volume off. It's because that offers a different experience than when the volume is on, but at the end of the day, movies are moving pictures, and you want to have something nice to look at. Besides the visual impressiveness of this movie, I was also happy with its sound. I got to experience the Batman in RPX, and that made it even better than it was in the first place. I loved how the sound consumed the theater I was in. At times it sounded as if the rain was in the room itself, and I really enjoyed how the music was also felt on top of being heard. In particular, it was during the scene in which Batman's at a precinct attempting to escape. These scenes in general had a lot of deep sounding percussion, and though some may say that it came off as a bit bare bones, the quality of the sound elevated it to a much higher level. In general, I thought that the overall use of music in The Batman was well done. The musical cues were great and not cheesy at all. The correct way to phrase that would be to say that they were effective. What I mean is that the musical cues came in at the right time and they supported what the visuals/story were attempting to do at that very moment. To be able to do this all at the same time requires a lot of attention to detail, and that's clearly seen in The Batman. Alongside how the music itself was used, I enjoyed how there were variations of the main theme. Not only did these variations offer enough familiarity to get the point across it was attempting to make, it offered something different at the same time. To some, stretching out one piece of music to work in multiple different forms may come off as lazy, but what's worth noting is that being able to do this effectively isn't easy at all. Creating original music to match the visuals and story of a movie isn't easy, and it's generally the norm to have a different piece of music per scene or general section of a movie, but I liked how it was done in The Batman. To me, there's more to be said about a composer that can do a lot with a little, and that's exactly what the music in The Batman showcases. Not only does it support the on-screen action that plays out during certain parts of the movie, it also helped guide it from one part to the next. With how long The Batman is, it's easy for a newcomer to be a bit uncertain in regards to how it'll play out. The problem is that some movies that go beyond 2 hours are unnecessarily long. It's either because they're too slow-paced, or they're stuffed with information that wasn't necessary, and the result is a bloated mess that could have been shorter than it ended up being. I don't think that all of The Batman was well-paced, but for the majority of the movie, it was. I like that it was the good kind of slow build-up because when something big did occur, it made itself known in a huge way, and it was well worth the wait. What's good about this is that due to how parts of the movie took their time, once the fast scenes were playing out, they meant even more because of what was set up beforehand. Simply put, The Batman is the kind of movie that knows when and how to push things or ease back a bit. There are many different examples that I could mention, but what most stood out to me was how the Batmobile was slowly introduced. In previous Batman movies, the Batmobile was either one of the first things you saw, or it was at the very least introduced within the first 10 to 20 minutes. That wasn't the case with the Batman. What's great is that you're slowly shown glimpses of car parts strewn about the main area of the Batcave, and you can imagine that Batman is either putting together the Batmobile for the first time, or he's doing some kind of maintenance on it. Either way, these small teases eventually added up to when the Batmobile finally made its on-screen debut. I'm sure that it wasn't a coincidence that this scene was partially shown during the first trailer for the Batman. The trailer straight up shows the Batmobile in its entirety, but they're brief glimpses, and not enough for you to get the full experience. With how the movie builds up to the full reveal of the Batmobile, the scene hits hard in more ways than one. Not only is it an aggressively fast chase scene with explosions, the scene featured great sound design. In particular, the Batmobile sounded great. It sounded like a beast of a car, and that's appropriate, seeing as how it's a souped-up muscle car. Other versions of the Batmobile seem more fantastical, so you'd think that they'd sound more out of this world, but this one's sound went hand in hand with how it looked, and I like that. In general, you could say that about the movie as a whole. This car chase scene was great not only because of how over the top it was, but also because it featured so many different angles. In some movies it might be too abrupt and nauseating to look at, so that itself shows that the Batman had good editing, but what really stood out to me about this was that it added different perspectives. It's possible that this doesn't apply to everyone that watched the movie, but what was great about this was that it put you as the viewer in different seats. One moment you were beside the Penguin and the next you'd be looking through Batman's point of view. I'm not trying to say that the scene would have failed if it had featured the car chase with an aerial view or something like that, but with how it was done, it created a greater sense of immersion. Even if the Batman is a dark movie, I liked how it was able to fit in humor every once in a while. In particular, this was thanks to Colin Farrell's performance as the Penguin. At times he seemed over the top, but it was the good kind of over the top, and it didn't leave me thinking that he needed to tone it down. If anything, I wanted to see more of the Penguin because of how charismatic he was. Many people hold different beliefs in regards to what makes a great actor, but for me, one of the signs of a great actor is that they're able to make you forget that you're looking at an actor. It definitely helped that Colin Farrell had makeup that completely changed his appearance, but his mannerisms and way of talking took his performance to a higher level. I noticed this not only by how into his scenes I was, but also because the Penguin managed to get the most laughs from the theater I was in. This goes back to the idea of the Batman being a dark movie. I think it's the sign of a great movie that it could slightly deviate from the overall theme it's set up, and yet still be able to keep moving in that direction without having suffered for what it did. It's possible that this could be different once the Penguin series is released, but I don't see them changing things up too much. As much as I enjoyed Colin Farrell as the Penguin, I thought that Alfred was underutilized. I realized that the movie is titled The Batman, and it's possible that many things were done or revolving around the idea that this is a movie about Batman, but I expected more out of Alfred. It also helps that Andy Serkis is a good actor. On the bright side, his scenes delivered the goods in more ways than one. You could say that less is more when it comes to Alfred, but there was one scene in particular that stood out to me. It involved Bruce getting ready to go to the mayor's funeral, and Alfred noticed that he was missing cufflinks. Bruce didn't care because his mind was on more important matters, but Alfred responded in a way that a father would. I thought the scene showed how selfless Alfred is and how much he loves Bruce. It's a small detail, but it works to showcase the relationship between Alfred and Bruce. It reminded me of how a father may tell their son to tuck in their shirt or straighten up their tie. The scene makes it clear that Alfred is doing this because as a Wayne, Bruce has an image to uphold, but there was more to it than just that. You could say Alfred was used in such a way as to leave viewers wanting more, but at the same time, it's easy to understand why Alfred wasn't featured as much as I would have liked. On the complete opposite side of things, I love how much was done with the Riddler. You could base an entire video on Paul Dano's portrayal of the Riddler, and there definitely are many things that I'd like to discuss in regards to his performance, but something that really stood out to me was his vocal range. Depending on the scene and the message he was attempting to get across, his voice would match what was being said. Sometimes he was angrily shouting, other times he was more low-key / mysterious, and other times he was even giddy with what was happening. In discussing Paul Dano's portrayal of the Riddler, it's hard not to think of Heath Ledger. Ever since The Dark Knight was released, many have believed that Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker was one of the greatest portrayals of a comic book character, but in general, you could easily say that his performance was simply a great one, no matter if this took place in a comic book movie. Seeing as how it's been around 2 months since The Batman was released, I'm sure that there have already been plenty of arguments started and settled over who's the better villain, Heath Ledger's Joker or Paul Dano. To me, the answer is simply that they're each different. Both actors clearly bring different things to the table, but seeing as how they're portraying villains that have different motivations and ways of enacting their fiendish acts, it's like comparing apples to oranges. What should be acknowledged is the fact that we now have 2 Batman-related performances that'll be enjoyed for years to come. I'm sure that some might chime in and say that Jack Nicholson's performance as the Joker should also be up there, but for me, there's a huge difference between how Jack Nicholson, Heath Ledger, and Paul Dano went about portraying their characters. With how the trailers and early parts of The Batman showcased the Riddler, I expected his identity to remain a secret for the entirety of the movie. I can understand why this wasn't done, seeing as how Paul Dano is a well-known actor and it'd be a waste to have a talented actor hidden from the audience for the entirety of a movie, but part of me still wanted it to be that way. Having said that, Tom Hardy's portrayal of Bane comes to mind, mainly because the majority of The Dark Knight Rises revolves around him being masked and having to make great use of body language to get his message across, but he wasn't as masked as Paul Dano's The Riddler was. I bring this up because I was hoping that they'd maintain the Riddler's mystique. I've already said why this most likely wasn't done, but I still think it would have been cool had we never seen Paul Dano's face. Not only would it have maintained the intensity that Paul Dano brought to this role, but it would have made him seem even more menacing than he already was. It's because once the Riddler was unmasked, there was a great difference between how it came off versus when his identity was still a secret. He was definitely still unhinged, but it wasn't the same as when he was contacting the Batman from afar and committing heinous acts. Something worth noting about Paul Dano's portrayal of the Riddler was that some of his most menacing moments came from afar or via smartphone-made movies. Towards the end, Paul Dano is clearly present and he continues to do a great job, but the bulk of his performance being the way that it turned out is what leads me to believe that it was not only well done, but most likely difficult to perform as a result of having to act to just a smartphone. It reminds me of something Ian McKellen once said. From what I recall, he mentioned being upset during some of the filming of The Hobbit because he was acting to a green screen instead of to a fellow actor, and that's not why he became an actor in the first place. I'm not an actor, and there's still a lot I have to learn about the craft, but what I do know is that acting is a team effort that requires 2 or more people playing off of each other. To remove that from the equation is to make acting even harder to pull off. It's for that reason, among many others, why I believe that Paul Dano did such a great job in his role. Rather than continuing to discuss Paul Dano as the Riddler, I'd like to bring up an issue I had with the Batman and Robert Pattinson's performance. When it comes to Western comic books, just about everyone has a different idea of what a comic book hero should be like. It also doesn't help that different comic book writers regularly change things up, so over time, contradictions can begin to pile up, and it creates a bit of a rift between a hero's own fan base. What I'm getting at is that to me, Batman is the balance between Bruce Wayne, Batman, and this movie didn't fully portray that. Batman Beyond's version of old Bruce Wayne pretty much acknowledges that he sees himself more as Batman than as Bruce Wayne, but that doesn't change how I feel. Bringing that up could lead to discussions related to which actor was the best Batman, Bruce Wayne, or both. My point isn't to discuss that here, seeing as how just about every actor brought a different interpretation of both characters to their respective movies, but what I will say is that previous Batman actors did a better job in balancing Batman and Bruce Wayne. The two that immediately come to mind are Michael Keaton and Christian Bale. You could include Ben Affleck in there as well, but even if he does a good job in portraying Bruce Wayne as a bit of a pompous elite, his portrayal leans more heavily towards Batman. With what we ended up getting, I preferred Robert Pattinson's performance as the Batman rather than as Bruce Wayne. It's because his version of Bruce Wayne is more or less a slightly watered-down version of the Batman. You could say that just means he's the actor that's gotten closest to portraying Batman and Bruce Wayne as one, but the difference between both was missing there. I thought that too much of the Batman spilled over into this Bruce Wayne. Another thing that stood out to me about Robert Pattinson's performance as both characters is that this version of Bruce Wayne / the Batman is really tortured. He's got a one-track mind, his emotions never really deviate from calm, angry, or subdued, and you get a sense that this version of the character is still greatly affected by what he experienced as a child. To an extent, that could be said of all versions of Batman, but there's a difference because, as I've been saying, they each come off differently as a result of how they're interpreted by their actors, writers, or directors. Robert Pattinson did a great job, and the fact that I felt personally affected by how bummed out this version of Bruce Wayne was means he was able to do a lot with his performance. I bring that up because this version of Bruce Wayne would leave most people asking him, "Hey bro, are you alright? Do you have something you want to talk about?" You could say that Alfred does that, to an extent, but seeing as how he's been with Bruce for so long, and is fully aware of why he is the way that he is, his concern would sometimes come off as quippy rather than as serious. There are points where this changed, but for the most part, Alfred had more of a hands-off approach when it came to offering emotional support for Bruce. While it's true that I would have liked a stronger distinction between Bruce Wayne and the Batman, something I liked was that Robert Pattinson was able to create an extension between both characters through the use of his voice. Rather than being over-the-top gravelly like Christian Bale or altered like Ben Affleck's, Robert Pattinson's Bruce Wayne / Batman voice was subtle. It was the kind of voice that conveyed his hurt and determination in regards to what needed to be said or done, and I liked that. I previously brought up how much I love seeing this movie in an RPX theater, mainly thanks to the quality of the sound, but sometimes I was left thinking that subtitles would have helped. I'm the kind of person that has subtitles on no matter what because it allows me to better experience the story and dialogue. It also doesn't help that some movies have the music / sound effects incredibly loud, the dialogue mixed in low, and the result is me having to constantly increase or decrease the volume. It's annoying to deal with, and seeing as how I can't control the volume at a theater, it can sometimes affect my enjoyment of whichever movie I happen to be watching. I wouldn't go so far as to say that my 3 viewings of the Batman were greatly affected by how the dialogue was mixed, but as I said, subtitles would have helped. It was noticeable every now and then when the Batman would talk. I liked how he got his message across, but the problem was that sometimes his voice came off as quiet mumbling. If anything, that's one of the reasons why I'm happy that the Batman is now on HBO Max. Not only will I be able to control its volume, I'll be able to watch it with headphones on. That's not the same as being in a packed theater with the sound blasting, but at least I'll get to experience the movie in a different way. Though I've largely been talking about the Batman and the Riddler as separate entities, the truth is that the movie is the way it is because of the conflict between them. I'm sure that there are some that have already gone in depth in regards to why the way things unraveled for both of these characters was well done, but I figured I'd still chime in with my 2 cents. I loved how the Riddler was able to put Batman in his place. It starts to come together towards the end of the movie, particularly during the interrogation scene at Arkham, and I loved that. I realize that it may sound strange to low-key be rooting for the villain, but it's not because I hate Batman. It's because it makes things interesting, and it leaves you wondering how will Batman overcome this situation. Seeing as how I'm in the middle of watching One Piece, This reminded me of when the Straw Hat crew were beaten down at the Saboidi Archipelago. I wasn't happy that they were being knocked around as if they were nothing, though the fight scenes definitely did get me hyped up, but as I said before, I knew that as bad as this moment was, the eventual triumph would be even greater. Simply put, a hero that can fall and rise again is a better one because more can be done with them. Seeing as how this is a Batman movie, it'd probably be more appropriate to say that we fall down so that we can get up again. It's not enough that the Riddler has caught the Batman off guard, but the subsequent explosions taking place all over Gotham help support what's happening. I thought these scenes were great because they came together at the right pace. The scene is slowly built up until it eventually explodes in more ways than one, and I liked that. By the time that Gotham was starting to come undone, I liked how the action was taken up a notch. In particular, the Gotham Square Garden scenes were great. The fight scenes that took place over the arena looked different, and overall, I was happy with the location in which this was taking place. Having frequently gone to similar styled arenas, it was easy to imagine something like this playing out in front of me. I realize that's probably thanks to my overactive imagination, but if you can somehow manage to build a connection between what's playing out on screen and the viewer, even if it's over the top and near fantasy level, the result is a better experience. It also helped that the Batman continued to be as aggressive as he's been all throughout the movie. What I especially liked was how aggressive Batman was when he injected himself with that green serum. Maybe I'm looking too much into this scene, but can it count as an Easter egg connecting Bane to this universe, making his appearance a possibility later down the line? I realize that probably won't happen, seeing as how we've already seen Bane in Batman and Robin along with The Dark Knight Rises, but including more of Batman's rogue gallery, even if with just small references, works towards world building. Once some time had passed since the Batman was released, I started to see people make all sorts of comments in regards to it. Some said it was great, some said this version of Batman was a step below the other ones, and others complained about specific scenes. In particular, some people were unhappy with the aftermath of the Gotham Square Garden event. They were unhappy that Batman was there lending a hand because they felt that it brought him down to their level. People can interpret things whichever way they want, but for me, that was the point. The point is to humanize Batman/Bruce Wayne, and for him to realize that the path he's currently on won't end well. It's not as if he needs to stop being the Batman. He just needs to change things up a bit, or else he'll eventually end up crossing over from being a vigilante to being a full-on criminal. This is made clear by how things play out. Not only is Batman attempting to clear wreckage to open up a path for trapped citizens, he leads them to safety, and an overhead shot is used to really get the point across. I like this because it goes back to how things were in the beginning. When the painted thugs were just about to assault the guy at the train station, Batman shows up, has them cowering in fear, but what's important to note is that even the guy that's just been saved is also fearful of the Batman. Towards the end of the movie, things have changed with the citizens of Gotham by how they follow Batman to safety. The Batman himself recognizes that he needs to change things up to be more efficient, and I like that he's willing to think things over and see how they can be improved upon. It's admirable for him to be as determined as he is, but to be too set in your ways can sometimes come back to cause you problems. The Batman recognizing this as a result of his experiences throughout the movie works as character development, and that's what you like to see. If it hasn't been made clear by now, I love this movie. I went to go see it 3 times at the theater, and each time I took someone else along. While I can easily say that I'll be rewatching this movie for many years to come, and that it's up there with The Dark Knight, I don't think it's a perfect movie. Some of the issues I had with it started to appear towards the end. I thought that its length started to be felt towards the later half, and the ending dragged on. What I mean is that I was reminded of the Return of the King endings. Frequent scenes are used to further the story and put a bow on things, but the problem is that each scene could have been used to end this movie. I didn't like this because it went against what I thought of the earlier half of the Batman, which is that it came off as great, and the majority of the movie didn't feel like a near 3-hour movie. It was towards the end that I started to think, get on with it. As I said before, I went to go see the Batman 3 times. It was mainly because I loved it that much, but also because it's the kind of movie that reveals things to you the more you watch it. It also helped that once I got home from each viewing, I'd look up Easter egg/obscure reference videos on YouTube. Those helped me enjoy things even more because it was easy to catch things that slipped by me during earlier viewings. For example, the old renewal sign after the district attorney is hit, the Riddler's glasses being seen at the church, and the Riddler's apartment scene with him taking pictures way before it's revealed that he was living there. It's not as if these details, among many others, drastically change the movie, but what this does is flesh things out and show you that a lot of attention to detail and passion went into making this movie. I'm sure that there are plenty of bad movies out there that had plenty of passion, but with this one, it's the cherry on top because it works even when all of that extra detail goes over the head of viewers. As I've made it clear, there's plenty that I liked about the Batman, but what I didn't mention is that it inspired me to look more into the character's media that I've yet to experience. There are plenty of comics out there that I'll eventually get into, but I enjoyed being inspired to look up and watch the animated movies I've missed out on watching over the years. While most of them weren't on the same level as, say, Mask of the Phantasm or Return of the Joker, I still enjoyed seeing them because not only does it flesh out my idea of who Bruce Wayne/Batman is, but at the end of the day, I was getting more Batman content to enjoy. As I've mentioned in other reviews, if your piece of media can do something to inspire me to further look into it or to seek out general related content, I'd say that you managed to accomplish something that very few can. The Batman is the kind of comic book movie that we needed at this point in time. It didn't perform on the same level as No Way Home, but what it did was show that comic book movies can work outside of the formula that's been utilized over and over again since the late aughts. I say that, and yet I've happily consumed just about each of those movies as they've been released, and I'll continue to do so. That may be true, but it's possible to be a fan of something and to recognize the potential for more to be done with the subject matter. Chances are, if you've made it up to this point in this review, you've already seen the Batman, so there's no real reason for me to say that I recommend it. What I will say is that if you know someone that hasn't seen it, try to convince them to watch it. I'm sure that some may not enjoy it because of how moody and graphic it can sometimes be, but the more movies like this are shown to a greater audience, the more studios and filmmakers will want to branch out, try new things, and deliver us movies similar to the Batman. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.